They thought Britain were sort of exacerbating how poor we were as a country.
The Americans couldn't believe that Britain, with this vast empire, the largest empire the world has ever seen, was actually broke. And this led to some really humiliating scenes. The Americans demanded that the Treasury open its books to them.
It was the real hope of Hitler, and Goebbels in particular in his diaries, is that it would split up. And the Allies would say, well, look, the Soviets are clearly a greater threat than Nazi Germany ever was. And you constantly see in Goebbels' diaries at this point, we've got to get the Allies to turn towards the East.
Churchill then himself promises that there will be a second front in 1943. Now, Churchill would say he kept this promise. The Allies did invade Europe in 1943. They invaded Sicily, and then they invaded Italy. But Stalin considered these diversions. He was absolutely adamant that the main Anglo-American attack on Hitler's fortress, as it was sometimes referred to, should come across the Channel and into France. And one of the reasons that Roosevelt is so unwilling to commit himself about his peace plans during the war is because of this electoral pressure. Britain, there are no elections. There are no elections in Britain between 1935 and 1945 for a 10-year period.
And none in Soviet Union, of course.
And yes, of course.
And obviously none in the Soviet Union.
In the summer of 1940, Britain was isolated, driven off the continent and without its Western European allies that had been overrun in a matter of weeks. It's often said that Britain now stood alone in the fight against Nazi Germany. Yet by the end of 1941, that had all changed. The Soviet Union came on board after Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, and the United States followed suit after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. And on New Year's Day, 1942, the so-called Big Three officially signed the UN Declaration, pledging to join forces to defeat the Axis powers. Three vastly different nations in an unlikely coalition which was vital in turning the tide against a common enemy. But what if it didn't last? What if, amidst the suspicions, ideological clashes and power struggles, the alliance fractured before victory was secured? What if the Big Three broke up? I'm James Hansen, and welcome to History Undone, the show where we look at how the briefest of moments can shape our world. Every week we focus on a different battle, military campaign or tide of history, and with the help of our experts we ask whether split-second decisions could have changed the outcome and history itself. Today we're discussing the grand alliance of Britain, the Soviet Union and the United States during the Second World War. Undoubtedly crucial to the outcome of the war, but both complex and fragile. And if it hadn't held, would the map of Europe and indeed the world look very different today? These are questions for our experts, and joining me as ever is the historian and author, Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry. And for the first time on the channel, we're delighted to be joined by the historian Tim Bouverie, author of the new book, Allies at War, The Politics of Defeating Hitler, which is out now. Welcome to you both. Tim, particularly welcome to you. Thank you for joining us today on History Undone. First of all, tell us a little bit about the book. What motivated you to write about the alliances of World War II?
Well, I think we all know that the alliance was militarily successful, and a huge amount has been written about the battles which defeated the Axis between 39 and 45. But I think comparatively there is less known about how this alliance was formed and how it operated. And it was, as you said in your introduction, an improbable and incongruous alliance, one between the British Empire, the United States and the Soviet Union, a communist country with very different ideological, political and economic goals for the war, and profound disagreements about grand strategy during the war itself. So the book aims to look at the politics of the alliance and to focus on those areas of conflict as well as cooperation.
And what I particularly love about it as well as focusing on the Big Three of Britain, the US and the Soviet Union, you also go into some of the other countries that maybe there isn't so much historical literature about. Ireland's role, Spain, Greece, you cover all of them.
Absolutely. I mean, the Grand Alliance was not envisaged in any way at the beginning of the Second World War. The alliance which was meant to hold the Germans was the Anglo-French alliance. This was the alliance that had held the German army for 4 years between 1914 and 1918. And it is only because of the absolutely unforeseen events of May-June 1940, the collapse of the French army in 6 weeks, that the whole global system of alliances and allegiances is completely upended, and Britain, for the first time, starts to court the United States and starts to try and mitigate these other powers that are either neutral or wavering on the side of the Axis, such as fascist Spain or the Soviet Union, which had been in de facto alliance with Nazi Germany since September 1939.
Well, it's great to have you with us today, Tim, and looking forward to exploring some of the intricacies of the alliances of World War II. Now, in front of us, we have a world map showing the alliances as they were in January 1942. The Western Allies are shown in blue, the Soviet Union and Eastern Allies in red, and then the Axis powers are in black. Let's start by asking, how do these alliances, the ones we see in front of us, come about? Dr. Chris Parry, always a pleasure to have you standing alongside me on History Undone. What is it that brings the big three together?
Before we talk about the big three, we've got to mention one other player here who really isn't brought in at any great level in these discussions that we're going to talk about, and that's China. Since 1931, they've been involved in hostilities with Japan. There's been quite extensive warfare going on. There's been interaction with the United States and also the other, what will become the Western allies. But the issue is that once the British Empire finds itself alone after France surrenders, of course, we get a situation where they have to fight Nazi Germany. They have to fight Italy, who's come in on the side of Nazi Germany as part of the Pact of Steel that was agreed in May 1939. But the Italians are not really ready for a war, so they wait until France is just about defeated before they come in. And of course, we then get the tripartite pact between Italy, Germany and Japan, who come in late 1940. Now, Britain, of course, is trying to court help from the United States. They're also thinking maybe if we can detach the Soviet Union from the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939, maybe we can have a saviour there. And in fact, Germany says, the Britons are either counting on the Americans or they're counting on the Russians here. And the Germans at this stage are very suspicious of the Soviets, that they might actually come west at any stage. There's pretty good literature in the Abwehr archives on that. So you've got a very testy situation. But what really changes everything is the commitment of Roosevelt to keep Britain in the game. He recognises the threat from Nazi Germany that may come to America one day, and he starts trying to convert an isolationist America into providing the sort of war materials that they need to sustain the game. Look at Ukraine today. Not actually fighting on the side of Ukraine, but supplying the war material and the expertise to be able to help. So you're in this sort of phony war situation in the Atlantic. Meanwhile, of course, the Soviet Union is supplying Nazi Germany with all the raw materials that it needs and quite a lot of technical expertise for their military, their aviation, their submarines and things like that as well. So it's not great. What changes the situation automatically here, of course, is Operation Barbarossa, when the Germans decide that actually, in order not to give Britain any more hope, we'll invade the Soviet Union, take them out. That happens in June 1941. So immediately the American position is, and Roosevelt is quite explicit about this, this is a turning point and we have to keep Russia in the war as well if we can. And he says this politically. The critical completion of the big three comes, of course, with the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. And critically, the fact that the Germans, in accordance with their tripartite pact in relation to Japan, say, right, we'll declare war on the United States.
Which is madness, really.
Well, it's extraordinary if you don't wait to be declared war on yourself. And then you get into a series of discussions, which I'm sure we'll go into the detail later, about what do we go for first? Do we go for Germany? Do we go for Italy? Do we go for Japan as the weakest partner? Or do we go for the strongest partner?
And Tim, it is fascinating the lengths to which Churchill in particular goes to from 1939 onwards to try and draw the US into the war. And Roosevelt is very sympathetic, but he's not necessarily in a position where he can commit until the attack on Pearl Harbor. But there's also the point, as you explain in your book, that many Americans simply think that Britain will fall. So they don't actually think that it's worth backing Britain until what, 1940, till the Battle of Britain, till Britain managed to see off the Luftwaffe?
Yes, I think it is really important to note that, firstly, before the Battle of France, the British government weren't even trying to bring the United States into the war. This was considered an event extremely unlikely in any case. But the British, with this vast empire, were very aware that the United States wished to dismantle the British Empire, that the United States wished to profit from the opening up of the closed markets that the British had, because the British Empire was then protected by tariffs. And the United States in those days did not like tariffs.
Imperial preference. Yeah.
They thought that tariffs caused war. They thought that tariffs decreased global prosperity. They were absolutely determined to eradicate this system of, as you say, imperial preference. The fall of France changes everything. But for a long time, the US does not think that Britain is going to survive. Very few people think that Britain is going to survive. And the consensus in America is, what is the point in sending equipment to Britain if it is simply going to be captured by the Germans, as the French equipment was captured in May, June 1940? And when Churchill starts asking Roosevelt, shortly after becoming Prime Minister in May 1940, for 50 of the Americans' most antiquated destroyers, World War I era destroyers, which will free up the Royal Navy's ships which are operating in the Atlantic to patrol the Channel, which is absolutely the first line of defense in an invasion, Roosevelt prevaricates. Eventually, the British have to offer a major deal. They offered the Americans 99-year leases on naval bases in the Caribbean and off the coast of Newfoundland. But at the same time, the Americans demand that Churchill make a public commitment that in the event of an invasion, in the event that it looks as if the British Isles are going to be overrun, Churchill will send the Royal Navy to Canada or North America, because if the Germans capture the Royal Navy, then suddenly America is extremely vulnerable. Churchill is extremely reluctant to give this pledge. You can't, on the one hand, ask the British people to fight to the last breath on the beaches, in the hills, on the streets, and at the other time broadcast plans for surrender. And it's completely different to the French and the British decision to sink the French fleet off North Africa at Mers el Kabir in July 1940. The French had then surrendered. The British hadn't. But nevertheless, the British were so desperate for American aid that the base leases were given and the promise was given.
And Chris, I think what's really important to stress here is, there's this age-old historical debate about how important are individual figures to history. But when it comes to the big three, the personal relationships are crucial. And the fact that Churchill and Roosevelt always had a very constructive relationship counts for a lot.
Well, it's interesting because when they first met earlier, they didn't get on at all. Roosevelt had a very unfavourable opinion of Churchill when he first met him, back when he was Under Secretary of the Navy, when Churchill had gone out to the United States. And it's only after, as Tim says, France falls that this relationship starts to pick up. And it's because Roosevelt really sees the threat from Nazi Germany. And as Tim says, he's afraid that the British fleet will be turned on America at some stage. And I think it's probably worth saying that, with the French fleet, there were genuine fears in America as well as in Britain that the fleet that was in Toulon, in Mers el Kabir and Alexandria would actually be used by the Nazis.
And so the sinking of the fleet at Mers el Kabir was a key moment to go, look, the Brits are serious here.
Yep, there's no doubt. If you look at the American press at the time, Roosevelt himself said, crikey, they are serious. And of course, what we're not saying, of course, is that Joseph Kennedy, JFK's father, was a huge megaphone as ambassador to the United Kingdom, saying they're not going to survive. They really aren't. And it enabled Churchill and everybody else to turn that around and say, look, we are going to fight. And as you said earlier, James, the American public opinion came on board, and so did the fight in the Battle of Britain. The fact we were able to sort of defend ourselves in the air as well. And so that picked up momentum. And you can see the shift in American media at the time. That it goes from passive sort of distant interest to real enthusiasm for Britain's survival. And that enables Roosevelt to say, well, in electoral terms, I can actually run with this a bit.
Yes.
And we mustn't forget, they're always looking at their domestic politics in relation to all of this. And I think what's really interesting at this stage is that there was the thought, are the French going to carry on either in their distant colonies or from North Africa? But they then realised they'd need 200 ships to actually transport enough troops and government machinery across to North Africa. But it's an interesting what if here, because if the French had decided to fight on and say, we will do it in the colonies or North Africa, I think we would then get a situation where the Germans said, fine, we're not having Vichy France, we're going to take over the whole of France. And that would have had really serious implications, I think, in the Mediterranean. And I suspect they would have taken over the shipping that was in Toulon harbour, which was obviously available to them. But we should be in no doubt that if we hadn't actually destroyed the French fleet at Mers el-Kabir, American opinion wouldn't have come on board. And I think there would have been temptations to take over some of the other stuff as well.
The two big turning points are the sinking of the French fleet at Mers el-Kabir, which is appallingly ironic. This has been Britain's ally a couple of weeks before, and it was necessary. The capture of this fleet would have transformed the entire capital ship ratio. The Germans had lost an enormous number of destroyers in Narvik Fjord in early 1940. That was one of the only good results of the otherwise disastrous Norwegian campaign. But the capture of the French fleet could have made Britain really vulnerable to invasion. And this tragic action on the 3rd of July 1940 is applauded not just in the United States, but across the world. You can see it in all the dispatches. Then the Battle of Britain. And the Battle of Britain earned Britain enormous respect. It should be remembered quite how suspicious the United States was of Britain in the period before the Battle of Britain, the fall of France. Britain had not paid her First World War debts back to the US. That was deeply resented. Britain was blamed for appeasement. Britain was not respected for its empire, despite the fact that America had elements of an empire in Puerto Rico and the Pacific. And Neville Chamberlain had nothing like the sort of close transatlantic relationship with Roosevelt that Churchill did. The Battle of Britain convinces the Americans that the British cause is worth fighting for, but it does not convince the Americans, and it does not convince Roosevelt, that America need enter the war. It is simply a case of trying to keep Britain in the war until something turns up. And it is only through a huge amount of lobbying and diplomacy across the Atlantic by the British, by first the British ambassador, Lord Lothian, and then by his successor, who was Foreign Secretary Lord Halifax, and led by Churchill, that Roosevelt is persuaded to give up the destroyers. And it is only by really comprehensively proving to the Americans that Britain has run out of dollars and gold reserves that America is persuaded
Which they were sceptical of. They thought Britain were sort of exacerbating how poor we were as a country.
The Americans couldn't believe that Britain, with this vast empire, the largest empire the world has ever seen, was actually broke. And this led to some really humiliating scenes. The Americans demanded that the Treasury open its books to them. They had to be externally audited. An American cruiser went to South Africa to pick up some of Britain's last gold reserves. Britain's investments, direct investments in the United States, most notably the Viscose Company, a subsidiary of Courtaulds, were sold at fire sale prices, all to convince a sceptical Congress and a sceptical American public that Britain really had not just scraped the bottom of the barrel, but got underneath it. So when Churchill says that Lend-Lease was the most unsordid act in history, that is not quite right. Lend-Lease made an inestimable contribution to Allied victory. It sustained the British Empire. It allowed the Allies really to win the war, including the Soviets. And a vast amount of American and British equipment went to the Soviet Union once the Soviet Union was in the war. But it came at a very heavy price. And I think it's very significant that while the British were always expected to repay the Lend-Lease debt and had to make major economic and geopolitical sacrifices, the Soviet Union never was. And part of that is because of the vast sacrifice that it felt that the Red Army was making between 41 and 45. But part of it was also because the Americans did not consider the Soviet Union to be an economic competitor. They had a closed economy. Communism was very, very different to capitalist America. It was the British Empire that was the rival to American commercial interests, and it was the British Empire, not the Soviet Empire, that had to be weakened at the end of the war.
Chris, we'll return to the US in due course, but Tim's mentioned the USSR. Let's talk a bit about the Soviet Union. Obviously, the key turning point is the invasion in 1941, Operation Barbarossa. But even before then, there have been efforts, particularly by the British, to try and build some bridges, have there not, with the Soviets?
There have been probes, but people are very suspicious of the intentions of Stalin. I think the shock of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939 reverberates right through.
Plus just the ideological difference.
I think the interesting connections that are occurring at this stage, of course, is you've got a large number of Soviet agents in Britain. So Stalin is actually getting a pretty good feed from the likes of John Cairncross, Guy Burgess and Maclean, people like that, who's just feeding them information all the time. So he's getting a heads up all the time about British intentions and indeed some of the communications that are going on with the Americans. Now, Stalin's always been suspicious that Britain and France were trying to push the Nazis towards the Soviet Union anyway. So he's always very suspicious of anything that comes from Britain at this stage. What's interesting at the same time is you've got Admiral Canaris, the head of the Abwehr in Germany, actually sending out signals saying, we're not all supporting Hitler here. Can we talk? And the Britons start to pick up on that, but Roosevelt absolutely ignores it and says this is a spoof. We're being led down the garden path here. We know subsequently, of course, that Canaris was playing a double game, and from his diaries that were captured, we know exactly what he was doing. He was trying to undermine the Nazi regime while protecting the interests of Germany. So you've got all these sort of things going on behind the scenes. But more importantly, every time we make a sort of connection with Stalin, we get mixed signals coming back about intentions. Once Barbarossa starts, of course, the floodgates open in terms of communication. And Stalin basically says, right from 1941 onwards, when are you going to start the second front then? And give me lots of material. I need it to fight. We're absolutely desperate here. And of course, when the Americans come on, the Soviet Union becomes as important as Britain in terms of supplying, as Tim says. And that Lend-Lease arrangement is then converted. And I think, Tim, 17.5 million tons of equipment by the end of the war goes into...
Certainly in that area.
Yeah.
Stalin is playing a very risky game. In his addled Marxist mindset, the British, the French and the Germans, they're all the same. They're all capitalist powers. And the Soviet ambassador to London in the early part of the war was said to record the tallies of deaths, both Axis and Allied, in the same column. This is all to the good of the Soviet Union. Stalin thinks he's being the master geopolitical manipulator. He is allowing the Germans to weaken these ancient enemies of the USSR, Britain and France. But this is, and in exchange for that, he is able to extend the Soviet Empire right back to where it was in Tsarist times. He's able to take over Eastern Poland. He takes over the Baltic states. He takes over Bessarabia in Romania. For the loss of very few men, although he suffers an extremely humiliating setback in trying to conquer Finland between November 1939 and March 1940, he thinks he's doing pretty well. But this is completely upended by the speed with which Germany succeeds in conquering France. And suddenly Stalin's calculations are up in the air, because now he is facing a very real prospect of a German threat, not an Anglo-French threat. And although he puts out some feelers towards the British and the French, he wants to make it very clear that while he might be collaborating with Hitler economically, he's not an actual ally. That may be considered semantics. He is at the same time desperately trying to appease Hitler, sending trainloads of wheat, timber and oil right up to June 1941, when there is overwhelming evidence that Hitler has decided to invade the Soviet Union.
Well, there's the real history of how the Big Three alliance came about. Now let's explore what the key points of tension were that might have led to it breaking up. This is History Undone. OK, well, as we've been discussing, it was, when you think about it, a pretty unlikely alliance between the big three. So let's explore the key points of tension once the alliance was established. Chris, I suppose that the key tension throughout was always, when is the Western Front going to be opened up?
Yes, as we said earlier, Stalin's keen for a second front to be opened up, particularly one that's close to Germany, so that you put pressure on Germany as soon as possible. And we've always said, the geographic distance between the Channel Coast here and the Ruhr and Saar regions of Germany, very productive regions, is quite short compared with what's happening here in the east. And Stalin bangs this drum throughout. The problem is that Roosevelt actually gives Stalin an assurance in 1942 that that's going to happen. And so Stalin is looking at various things going on between the Americans and the British. And of course, Churchill's agenda is to go for the soft underbelly, as he calls it. He wants to go through the Mediterranean. We've got a lot of interest in the Mediterranean. We've got a fleet operating out of Alexandria. We've got Gibraltar, we've got Malta, and lots of interest there that concern us, particularly the route through the Suez Canal. We fought the campaign in North Africa against the Italians and the Germans, the Afrika Korps, and we have real concerns that Greece and some of these other countries will fall into the Soviet orbit if the war continues as it is. So there's a real interest in getting involved here. Now, the other problem is we don't have the landing craft or the resources or the manpower across from America to be able to help us get onto
there's no way you could have
continent.
done D-Day in 42.
And so there are all sorts of things. And so what we can do, though, of course, is we can invade North Africa, which is what happens. There's then a decision made that actually Casablanca, that Churchill, and this is interesting, Stalin is excluded from this because he doesn't want to travel. So Roosevelt and Churchill, with Charles de Gaulle standing in the background, they agree that they're going to invade Sicily and Italy next. So Stalin's pretty put it out at this stage that that's going to happen. We're not getting this second front, so that's not happening. And there's all sorts of noises coming out about, we're trying to, defeat the Nazis here in the East, and you're messing around here in the Mediterranean. What's happening?
Yeah.
And so throughout the war, there's this constant drumbeat for the second front in Northern Europe. It's not possible practically. You have this. You have various debacles of raids. The Dieppe raid, for example, goes completely wrong, and there simply aren't enough landing craft. Now, in the background as well, it's worth mentioning, is within the United States itself, there is a tension. Although Britain and America have signed up for Germany first as being the main focus of the Grand Strategic Campaign, there is a constant tension, particularly led by Admiral King, the Commander-in-Chief and Chief of Naval Operations, to devote more resources to the Pacific. And we've got to remember that after Pearl Harbor, the Americans were really vulnerable.
You can understand that argument. I mean, where were America attacked?
Yeah.
In the Pacific.
And that's a really good point, because most Americans are thinking, well, what has Germany done to us? Nothing. The Japanese have. So there's a lot of opinion whereby they're saying, look, the Pacific, and there's this constant pressure the other way from Admiral King and the Pacificists saying, we need to devote more resources here. And of course, you get Guadalcanal, which is a real life and death struggle in the Solomon Islands, and that brings tension as well. So Marshall, General Marshall, who obviously is the head of the army, and Admiral King, the head of the Navy, are having this constant fight as to where the resources need to apply.
Tim, we mentioned the personal relationship earlier between Churchill and Roosevelt. What about the personal relationship between Roosevelt and Stalin, and between Churchill and Stalin? Presumably that was always far more fractious.
It was certainly more fractious between Churchill and Stalin. Roosevelt didn't get to meet Stalin until November 1943, when they met in Tehran. And I think both Churchill and Roosevelt showed themselves at their least perceptive and least capable in dealing with Stalin. There is, as Chris just said, this enormous pressure from Stalin, from the Soviet Union, to re-invade the continent. The real problem is that Roosevelt promises the Soviets in the summer of 1942 that there will be an Anglo-American invasion of Europe that year in September, a promise which he knows he cannot keep. He's been told by General Marshall, the head of the American army, that he cannot keep it.
What was he doing by saying that then?
He was just desperate to keep the Soviets in the war. He felt he had to give them hope. He said at the same time, I would rather lose New Zealand and Australia than that the Russians should go out. And Stalin is always hinting darkly that he could come to a separate peace with Hitler, which is not an unfathomable idea considering that he had been collaborating with Hitler before. He is always hinting darkly that this could happen. Roosevelt feels he needs to keep the Soviets in the war, he needs to encourage them, but the Americans pay for this false promise. And Churchill then pays for his. In August of 1942, Churchill decides that he has to do this extraordinary long trip through the Mediterranean to Tehran and then up to Moscow to tell Stalin that there is going to be no second front in 1942. And in his memoirs, he likened it to carrying a lump of ice to the North Pole. But in the Kremlin in August 1942, he says there isn't going to be a second front in Europe, but we are going to reinvade North Africa. This is Operation Torch. Stalin seems, after being very grumpy about this to begin with, to accept this. But Churchill then himself promises that there will be a second front in 1943. Now, Churchill would say he kept this promise. The Allies did invade Europe in 1943. They invaded Sicily, and then they invaded Italy. But Stalin considered these diversions. He was absolutely adamant that the main Anglo-American attack on Hitler's fortress, as it was sometimes referred to, should come across the Channel and into France. And this constant sense that the Americans and the British were stringing him along persisted right throughout the war, even to the dying days. We're about to celebrate VE Day. And even in May 1945, Stalin was having sort of nightmarish visions that the Allies, that is the Western Allies, the British and the Americans, might be trying to cheat him out of his great victory and somehow use the remnants of the Wehrmacht to push back the Red Army to a sphere which they felt they were comfortable. So it's an extremely difficult relationship for military reasons, but also, as we may come on to discuss, ideological and territorial reasons.
Chris, what was the point of maximum tension or even of frustration from the Soviet point of view? Was it 1943 when, for example, you got the Battle of Kursk, the largest battle in the history of warfare, huge Russian casualties? They're probably thinking, hang on a minute, open up the Western Front already.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, Stalin's getting information from the spies, both in Britain, but also in Japan as well. They're getting quite good information through their embassy in Japan about the dilatory nature of all this. And he's watching, as Tim says, what's going on in the Mediterranean. What he's trying to do is say, look, you can help us break through by becoming that diversion. Once you get troops on the ground in Western Europe, we can really push forward. And to his credit, he says, when we do Bagration, which is the big assault, of course, on Army Group Centre, he says, I want to time it with what becomes D-Day. And that's, in fact, what happens. And as we've seen in the past, you've got a situation where Allied grand strategy is coordinated to the extent that the Germans are split two ways. They're actually fighting literally, tactically on two fronts at that stage. So that works really well. But of course, the other pressure on getting on the continent of Europe, and it is discussed, is how far will the Soviets get? If we don't get on the continent of Europe, will they stop at the borders of Germany? And this is discussed widely in America. Are they going to continue to liberate France? Are they going to liberate Belgium and the Netherlands? And so there is a tension to get on the continent, not just to satisfy Stalin, but to make sure they don't come too far west.
Yeah, the great irony is that it's the Soviets who are begging the British and the Americans to reinvade the continent, and it's the British and the Americans who say no. But if the British and the Americans had managed to reinvade the continent in 42, an impossibility, 43, a distinct unlikely, it is the British and the Americans that would have liberated Central and Eastern Europe, not the Soviets. So there's an extraordinary irony about the geopolitical situation at the end of the war and who was asking for what at which time.
Tim, how close did the Big Three alliance actually come to breaking down?
I don't think it came terribly close to breaking down. The Anglo-American alliance, despite an enormous number of tensions and disagreements, never did. As Chris mentioned, Admiral King and many in the US Navy kept on wanting to send resources into the Pacific to fight the Japanese, and Roosevelt, to give him a lot of credit, consistently overruled them in the early days. And of the early days of the Anglo-American alliance, he recognized that Germany was the most formidable part of the Axis. He realized that Germany had to be defeated first, and that after that it would have been comparatively easier to defeat Japan. There were moments where it seems that Stalin did explore peace terms when Operation Barbarossa began, so the very early days of the Grand Alliance, and possibly even later during the summer offensives of 1942. But there was this great adhesive substance that kept these three powers together, and that was Adolf Hitler in Germany. And the common enemy was what kept these powers together despite their profound ideological and strategic and geopolitical differences.
What was interesting at the end of the war was the real hope of Hitler, and Goebbels in particular in his diaries, is that it would split up. And the Allies would say, well, look, the Russians are clear, the Soviets are clearly a greater threat than Nazi Germany ever was. And you constantly see in Goebbels' diaries at this point, we've got to get the Allies to turn towards the East.
Yes.
And we can help them. And there's this delusion that persists right up until VE Day when they finally surrender. Even Dönitz, the Grand Admiral who takes over as a Führer, is saying, look, we're not the real threat, are we? It's the Soviets coming from the East. I think the other thing that's worth considering about the Pacific is there is another lever as well trying to draw resources there, and that's one of Roosevelt's political rivals, and that is General MacArthur.
Yes.
So he's looking over his shoulder saying, is MacArthur going to run against me in one of the elections that's coming up?
Well, that's a very good point. And actually, it's interesting that, for example, in the 1940 presidential election, even though there's still a massive isolationist streak in the Republican Party, their candidate, Wendell Willkie, is actually a sort of a liberal internationalist.
Yes, Roosevelt is fortunate that this election, this crucial 1940 election, does not become a do we support Britain or not election, because Wendell Willkie, as you say, was committed to the support of Britain. He gave his backing to the Destroyers for Bases deal, and then he gave key testimony in the Lend-Lease debate in Congress. There is thereafter a lesser threat that Roosevelt was going to be defeated in the 1944 election, but he does have to continue to think politically. And one of the reasons that Roosevelt is so unwilling to commit himself about his peace plans during the war is because of this electoral pressure. Britain, there are no elections. There are no elections in Britain between 1935 and 1945 for a 10-year period.
And none in Soviet Union, of course.
And
yes, of course.
Obviously none in the Soviet Union. But Roosevelt was also determined that the US was not going to make the mistake that he had seen it make in 1918 when Congress had refused to ratify the Versailles Treaty, when Congress had refused to join the League of Nations. He wanted to build up American opinion so that it realized that there might be, as presidents then and presidents now call, this big, beautiful ocean here separating America. But the world had got a lot smaller. Dakar, which in West Africa, which Roosevelt was really concerned about and was constantly urging the Allies to take, as eventually they did after Operation Torch, is not that far across the Atlantic. If the British had gone under, had the British fleet been captured, then America would have been in a vulnerable position. I'm not saying America could have been conquered, but in a vulnerable position. And he is determined that America can never retreat into isolationism again. There must be a major international organization which will do two slightly contradictory things. On the one hand, it will include everyone. It will build what Wendell Willkie himself called one world. We must have voices for all of the nations, and we must not act in a unilateral way and be doing secret deals. And yet the pragmatic side of him said, it's got to be run by the big powers. It is the great powers that will have power in the Security Council, and the great powers, he believed, were the United States, the British Empire, the Soviet Union, and nationalist China. And Roosevelt is much more clear-sighted about China than Churchill is. Churchill, encumbered by Victorian racial prejudice and the empire, cannot see China as a great power. But Roosevelt, right from the beginning, is saying we must support China because this is a country of almost 500 million people, and one day they're going to count for something in this world. And do you want the Chinese allied with us, or do you want the Chinese allied with the Soviets? And in that, he proved prescient if, after his death, that vision was not able to be realized.
I think there's one way in which you get a split, and that is if the Americans don't win the Coral Sea, Midway and Guadalcanal.
Ah, interesting.
So if the Japanese get their way and they're able to break the link between America and Australia, they're able to extend down into the Solomons and beyond, and they're able to push forward to Hawaii, the Americans are going to be suddenly very focused on the Pacific because it's coming very close to the West Coast at that point. And so if the momentum of the Japanese had been sustained and those 3 victories hadn't been achieved, you're suddenly seeing the Americans saying, hey, we're in the wrong fight here. And the focus would have come off possibly what was going on here. So we might have reverted very much to let's resupply Britain, let's resupply the Soviet Union. And of course, the Soviet Union then has a free hand.
That's a really interesting point. By the way, we have done episodes, it's worth saying, on both the Battle of Midway and Guadalcanal, so go and check those out if you haven't seen them. Just on the issue that you raised, Tim, about what happens after the end of the war and that kind of post-war settlement. Of course, what makes the Big Three alliance even more remarkable is what comes next and the Cold War. In your view, when does the Cold War really begin? Does it begin at the end of the Second World War, or is it 1949?
Certainly the seeds have been sown in 1945. Arguably, the seeds have been sown much earlier. I mean, there are elements of the Cold War which begin from the moment that the Russian Revolution occurs. And Churchill, as he said himself, tried to strangle the Russian Revolution at birth. And there are American troops in the far east of the then Soviet Union taking part in the Russian Civil War in a, albeit extremely limited, capacity. The irony about it is that none of these 3 powers wants the Grand Alliance to end. The Americans don't want it to end, the British don't want it to end, and even Stalin doesn't want it to end. Stalin recognises that this has been an absolutely devastating war. It has devastated the Soviet Union, and there has to be a period, he says, of at least 20 years peace. He has got a certain respect, even admiration for Roosevelt, and he has a deep suspicion but sort of respect for Churchill. The problem is that all 3 of these powers, or certainly the Western powers and the Soviet Union, have very different ideas about how this cooperation will continue to work. The Soviet Union is committed to a spheres of influences deal, and Churchill makes his famous percentages agreement with Stalin in October of 1944, whereby they try and apportion influence in Eastern Europe and the Balkans. But spheres of influence are all very well. Roosevelt and the Americans had a sphere of influence over the whole of the Western Hemisphere. It's called the Monroe Doctrine. But spheres of influence have to remain open and broadly free. And the idea in the West that they could have made this vast sacrifice for liberty, for the rights of small nations, for self-determination, and then to have their ally, the Soviet Union, dominate and strangle the liberties, democracy in Eastern Europe is totally unconscionable. And Stalin can't understand this. He cannot understand how public opinion works in Britain and America. Whenever Churchill and Stalin say to him, well, Parliament, Congress, public opinion will find this very hard to understand, what you're doing to Poland. You're not helping the Poles in the Warsaw Rising of August 1944. He thinks this is an excuse because he doesn't have to deal with public opinion.
He can't comprehend that.
He cannot comprehend that. And similarly, the Western powers cannot really comprehend that Stalin is absolutely determined to dominate this area, despite the fact that he pays lip service to multiple declarations about a free and independent Poland and liberty and democracy existing in Eastern Europe. They can't quite realise until fairly late on in the war the true nature of his ambitions, which hadn't changed between the early days of the war and the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and Yalta.
And also, we've got to remember, at the end, he's dealing not with Churchill and Roosevelt, he's dealing with Attlee and Truman.
Truman, yes.
So the personalities are different. There's also another aspect, of course. He knows about Operation Unthinkable, which is where the Allies have a plan, which we've discussed before, is pretty impractical and was never, ever put up to succeed, is actually attacking the Soviet Union to get a fair deal for Poland.
So he was kind of right to have some suspicions.
Yeah, and then at Potsdam, of course, Truman says to him, you know, we've got an atomic device now. And Stalin brushes it off and says, yeah, OK, I understand that. And of course, then it's demonstrated at Hiroshima and he suddenly gets it.
And Stalin knew Stalin knew that he had the Manhattan Project was deeply infiltrated by Soviet agents. So he knew, and it is very interesting, it is absolutely bizarre that Roosevelt himself knew that the Manhattan Project had been infiltrated and doesn't tighten security. Stalin knows, but he also knows that the British and the Americans haven't officially told him. And so that is a constant source of suspicion in his already paranoid mind. What is it that they are developing? And what's it for?
In a counterintuitive way, though, did that almost strengthen the alliance? Because it goes to show, if you're Stalin, hang on, we can't be too, we've got to be careful with the Americans because they have got the bomb.
It's going to increase the paranoia. I mean, as I said, at Potsdam, Stalin brushes it off. As Tim says, he knows about it, and he thinks it's just a big bang. It's only when it's demonstrated at Hiroshima that you suddenly see Stalin saying, we need one.
Yeah.
And the idea that that sort of weapon of that destruction, a decisive novel weapon, is available to the Allies, obviously gives them pause, because they've been confident they've got mass on the ground that can do almost anything in Eastern and Central Europe, and even beyond, if they like. They can encourage subversive movements in some of these liberated countries. Suddenly, the appearance of the atomic weapon changes everything. And of course, that's going to make them even more paranoia. And as you know, there were a series of various campaigns to actually bring together aerial bombing that would take place in the late 1940s that included a large number of nuclear atomic weapons that would devastate Soviet cities if they misbehaved. So Stalin would have seen the end of that and seen how it would turn out. And of course, they're immediately on guard against what could happen.
OK, now let's get into what we love doing here on History Undone and ask ourselves, had the alliance broke down, what some of the long-term consequences would have been? Would each country have gone it alone in the fight against Nazi Germany? Would they have turned on each other? Let's explore that. OK, we have a new map in front of us now. This is the world as it looked at the end of the war in 1945. I think we want to explore now, had the alliance broken down, what the long-term consequences would have been. And Tim, just to kick things off, when we talk about the alliance breaking down, there's two ways of looking at it. You could say, well, it's because they fell out and let's say the Soviet Union decided enough of this, we're pulling out. There's also the risk that the Soviet Union is defeated, say, that Barbarossa succeeds. What if they were defeated at the Battle of Stalingrad?
In a sense, the Soviet Union can't be defeated. As somebody says to Stalin, as long as you keep retreating, this continent-sized country will absorb any force. But it is entirely possible that had the Germans managed to take Moscow, although the Soviets had already decided to evacuate to Kuibyshev, and had the Soviets lost the Battle of Stalingrad, it is at least conceivable that the Soviet Union drops out of the war. Certainly, during the early stages of Operation Barbarossa, Stalin is musing about the idea, could he buy Hitler off by giving Hitler Ukraine, this country which he is already himself devastated with a famine in the 1920s. So without that, without the Soviets, the war would have lasted for a considerably longer period of time. All of the resources, particularly oil, which the Axis would have gained from the Soviet Union, and the just sheer rate of attrition which the Soviet Red Army was able to bring to bear against the Wehrmacht was absolutely critical to victory.
And if the Soviet Union is knocked out, so is Britain.
You think it follows like a domino?
Yeah, because you've got a situation where they're controlling all the resources here in Western Europe up to possibly the Urals. And of course, the whole point of attacking the Soviet Union was to take Russia out so that Britain wouldn't have any hope.
I don't think so if America's in by that stage.
I'm not sure if they can reinforce Tim quickly enough to be able to save. I mean, that's the point. If you knock out the Soviet Union in 1941, okay, you can turn on Britain pretty quickly.
And presumably also, what would exacerbate the fact is that then the argument that Admiral King, for example, is making of, well, we need to be Pacific first, gets strengthened even more, does it not?
Arguably, but arguably not as well. I think what Roosevelt had realised, which is why they went for the Germany first strategy, is that Germany is the more threatening power.
Yeah.
And if Germany is suddenly dominant because Russia's gone out this way and that way, I think it reinforces the idea of a Germany first strategy. So,
I mean, let's have a look at this. I mean, if you are in 1941 between Barbarossa and Pearl Harbor, if you are the American public, what do you think the chances of Britain are at this point? You're back in the same calculus again.
As you were prior to the Battle of Britain.
And all those divisions that are committed to the Soviet Union are suddenly coming west. You've got the aviation support as well. And suddenly, that becomes a bit of a fortress which is under siege. You then get pressure in the Mediterranean from the Italians as well. So the links through the Mediterranean are pretty poor. So if we get Russia knocked out, even Britain knocked out at any stage, it alters the balance of this. And I just wonder if the United States says at that point, OK, we get it. We need to actually stall for time here and really see where our options are.
Well, and I also wonder, Tim, if that happens, do you actually get other countries officially joining the Axis powers at that point? Does Franco's Spain, for instance, at that point decide, you know what, I'm going to officially join the Axis?
Well, Franco famously said that he was wanting to join the war at the hour of the last cartridges. Actually, sorry, it was his foreign minister who said that, because Spain cannot possibly take part earlier. Spain has been devastated by civil war in the 1930s, but a lot of people would jump onto that. There is another counterfactual which we haven't discussed, and that is the continued threat of Chiang Kai-shek to make peace with the Japanese. They're holding this line centred around Chongqing, and if that happened, suddenly 400,000 Japanese, which are along the front doesn't move much between 1940 and 1945, but suddenly all of these Japanese forces are available to take part potentially in the invasion of India. And the British great fear after the Japanese descent in 1941, 1942 into the Pacific, Singapore, Malaya, Burma, is that there will be a link of the Axis, that the Japanese coming through here will come through India, through Iran and Iraq, and meet the Germans, who are on the one hand coming through the Soviet Union, and on the other hand are pushing back the British and British Commonwealth forces in North Africa. And that really is an almost strategic game over.
And that is a fascinating point, because as much as you might say it's Nazi Germany who are the main beneficiaries if the big three break down, Japan would massively benefit.
Yeah, absolutely. And as Tim mentions, nearly 500,000 men, but also the aviation support and the logistics associated with it as well. That gives them free rein in this greater Asian prosperity sphere that they're trying to set up here. Australia is threatened. Certainly the thrusts into the Pacific become much more powerful. They're able to build up their navy. They've got additional resources. I mean, the Japanese built quite a few carriers during the Second World War to replace the ones that have been lost. But I think the issue then becomes a situation where you've got America isolated and Canada isolated from Europe at this point. They're under pressure in the Pacific. And as we said, if the Coral Sea, Midway and Guadalcanal hadn't gone the right way, you're right up close against the west coast of the United States as well. And although it's a continental-sized power, rather like the Soviet Union, it's got powers of recovery. It's difficult to imagine how they could have taken on both Germany, fortified as it was in Germany, and Japan as well.
Are we almost saying, Tim, that more likely than the alliance, the big three alliance, breaking down or them turning on each other, was that maybe they would just decide to go it alone individually?
The big three don't turn on each other because they understand the military risks, but that means making major political and moral sacrifices. The British and the Americans have to continually suppress their feelings about certain things that their Soviet ally is doing. For instance, when the Germans invade the Soviet Union in 1941, they discover the mass graves in the Katyn forest, which contain the bodies of eventually discovered 21,000 Polish prisoners of war who have been murdered by the NKVD on Stalin's orders in the spring of 1940. Stalin, master of dissimulation, completely brazens it out and says these Poles were murdered by the Germans. The British know full well that they weren't murdered by the Germans. The Americans suspect they weren't murdered by the Germans. The Poles certainly know they weren't murdered by the Germans. But the British and the Americans have to go along with this. They have to go along with that lie. They then also have to go along with Stalin's refusal to aid the Warsaw Rising of August 1944. They have to go along with the insults that Stalin throws at the bravery of the British Army and suggestions that the British and the Americans really wish to see the Soviet Union defeated. They make promises which they can't keep. Military expediency, the military expediency of keeping the Soviet Union in the war is recognized in both London and Washington as paramount. And at the same time, there is this huge diet of propaganda on the heroic deeds of the Red Army, which is lapped up by the British and the American public. If you were to say to the British or the American public that the Grand Alliance might not survive the war, they would be shocked, but also scandalized. This was Uncle Joe. These were the brave comrades who were sacrificing themselves to preserve European liberty, as they were being told. The films about the Battle of Stalingrad were given a hugely popular reception in British and America, and Stalin himself, in British cinemas, when he appeared on newsreels, would get more of an ovation than either Churchill towards the end of the war or the King did.
Chris, final thought from you. It's worth saying we are recording this the week before the 80th anniversary of VE Day. Without the big three, the world today would look very different.
Oh, yes. There's no question. If all three countries had gone their own way, they'd have had different destinies, they'd have different fates. We still probably would have had a totalitarian regime right at the heart of Europe. And I think one thing that's worth remembering is however bad the Soviet Union was, the Nazi regime in Germany was a lot worse in terms of what it did. Mass killings, of course, in the Soviet Union associated with the pre-war and during the war, but nothing compared with what Nazi Germany was threatening. And Churchill himself made speeches about the barbarism that would descend on Europe if Germany wasn't defeated. And of course, Japan in the Pacific, acting in very much the same sort of way, militarism on the rise, defeated. And of course, we have the world today because, both forms of totalitarianism were defeated, but in 2 world wars and of course in the Cold War itself.
And Tim, final thought from you. Are there lessons to be learned today from the unlikely alliances of World War II?
There are huge lessons to be learned. As Chris said, without the Grand Alliance, without alliances, the Nazi project would have succeeded and Hitler would have won the war. And as Churchill said repeatedly throughout the Second World War, there's only one thing worse than fighting with allies, and that is fighting without allies. The war was won because of allies, and however infuriating allies can be at times, it is far better to work with them than to work without them. And I think that that is a lesson that the world really needs to remember at the moment.
Well, gentlemen, this has been absolutely fascinating. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. My thanks to Tim Bouverie and Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry for joining me. And we'll be back undoing more history very soon. But in the meantime, remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel, History Undone, on YouTube. And don't forget, you can also listen to the show wherever you get your podcasts. And we'll see you next time. Goodbye.